So today we're going to get into the somewhat strange and obscure world of the three realms of existence in early Buddhism, more or less, coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing to the channel. So today's topic, the three realms of existence, is a bit, I would say, out of the center of what I usually talk about, because it's a little bit less what we might call secular. It's a little bit more what we might call traditional religious in a lot of what we're going to hear today. But it doesn't have to be. There are ways of approaching this from a more secular perspective, or if you happen to be a traditional believer, then that's fine too. I don't want to disabuse anybody if that's the way you want to look at things. If you think that this is, if you want to look at this as an accurate description of reality. So what I'm going to do is give a sort of a short introduction to the whole topic, because I think it needs some introducing within especially a contemporary context. And then I'll give, my discussion of the three realms of existence and wrap it up at the end. As introduction, it's tempting to see the Buddha as very much like us, as the sort of person that we could run into today on the street, a sort of bourgeois, if you like. I mean, for want of a better term, sort of intellectual, and I think some ways of reinterpreting the Buddha or of understanding the Buddha tend to sort of go in that direction. And to be fair, this is partly caused or brought about by the character of many of the early texts, which are very approachable, which could have been many of them written today or yesterday. I mean, many of them, I would say most of them, deal with topics which, while somewhat abstruse a little bit and somewhat deep a little bit and psychologically deep and sort of interested in minutiae, nevertheless are the sorts of things that speak to us today, to many of us, most of us today, in a very modern, contemporary kind of voice. But I think we make a mistake if we think of the Buddha being somebody absolutely like us, because the Buddha lived, at the end of the day, in a very different world. He lived 2,500 years ago in a part of India that was very remote, and in a part of the world, in a part of time that was, in many ways, as remote from today as anywhere in recorded history. So, to that extent, it shouldn't be surprising to us when we find certain elements of the Buddha's worldview being to us very strange and unusual. In fact, I would submit that it would be very strange if he didn't have such beliefs, because, given from where he came from, the amount of history between the two of us, between all of us, that's what we would expect. And indeed, if we look back, I think it's important also to look back at our own quote-unquote Western tradition, the tradition that comes up from ancient Greece. Because I can remember reading, let's say, Plato, the dialogues of Plato, who was, in some respects sort of similar to the Buddha, lived at a similar time period, a very similar time period actually, and similarly was a very deep and great philosopher, and similarly really founded much of what we think of as philosophy. He was one of the founding people who was so important to Western thought, in the same way that the Buddha was so important to world thought now, but also to thought in the East. And if you go and read, let's say, the early dialogues of Plato, he comes across, both him and Socrates being sort of his mouthpiece, as very reasonable sorts of people. Now, of course, they have some beliefs we may agree with or not agree with, but they come across as people that we can sort of have a normal conversation with. And the points of the dialogues, which we find in early Plato, are dialogues we could almost be having today with the kinds of subjects they're speaking about and the way that they're speaking about them. But then, as you get through the books of Plato, you come upon a book like the Timaeus, which is one of the later dialogues of Plato, which all of a sudden, things seem to sort of go off a deep end, if you like. All of a sudden, we're talking about the demiurge, which is this kind of godlike figure that created all of reality. We're talking about the world soul that is somehow created by the demiurge, and the world soul is somehow bound up in the creation and existence of the elements, and it really gets pretty wild. And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of similarity between that kind of metaphysical cosmology and the sort of more down-to-earth stuff we found in the early texts. But it's the same guy who did both of them. It's just that he did them at either different times in his life, or perhaps with different mindset. Who knows? And similarly, if we read, let's say, a more modern philosopher like Descartes, who had some wonderful things to say about, let's say, doubt. He asked us, how do we know? Here I am sitting in front of a fireplace. How do I know I'm not dreaming? Because I could just be dreaming that I'm in front of the fireplace. And use that kind of as a sort of an introduction, sort of entryway into deep doubt about all things, or nearly all things. And we can read some of those thoughts of Descartes and see him as very modern in many ways, and we could almost see him as somebody we would run into right now. But Descartes also had another book about cosmology, where he talked about the way the stars wandered around in the heavens, and the shooting stars, and these kinds of vortices of matter that whirled around the stars and that caused comets to go in one direction or another. And all of that stuff seems really quite wild, and certainly is not the sort of thing that anybody believes nowadays about the way the heavens work. So I don't say all this to say necessarily that what the Buddha said, that I'm going to come into in a minute, that all the Buddha said was wrong. That's up to you to decide. What I am saying is that philosophers of all times have had some views that were down to earth and understandable, but at other times said things that were really, in comparison, somewhat wild and outside of the ordinary way of perceiving things. And so it would be unusual to find the Buddha not having done so. And in fact, we find that the Buddha did have a lot of things to say about these three realms, the three realms of reality. And one last thing before I get to them is the question, why should we care? Why should we care about such things? And there are three possible answers. The first answer is that, we're traditional believers, and we think that these realms really exist, or potentially may really exist. And so to that extent, if we're traditional believers, then the question answers itself. We want to know about the world. Or we may be simply interested in the history of ideas. That would be the way I would describe myself here. That is, I am interested in the way that these ideas developed. I'm interested in the early development of those ideas, because so much of what the Buddha said fits together in various ways. And so I think it's both interesting and can be, to an extent, a real learning experience to try to understand the Buddha's way of viewing things, even if we don't necessarily agree with them. And the third, which is related to the second, is that we may understand these as metaphors in one way or another. And so even if we don't take them as literally true, we may take them as metaphorically true, and I'll get to some of that at the end. So, the three realms. These are in Pali the Kama Loka, the Rupa Loka, and the Arupa Loka. And we'll get to each of them in turn. The Kama Loka is the world of sense desire. The Rupa Loka is the world of form, and Arupa Loka is the world of formlessness. So the first one is the world of sense desire. And I should say sometimes these are described with different terms. They're called the triple element in some places. They're called realms, they're called worlds. It doesn't really matter for our purposes. But the first one is the world of senses. And this is the world that surrounds us, the world that we can come into touch with through our physical senses. That is to say, the five senses of touch, of taste, of smell, of hearing, and of sight. And if we can do that, then we're in the Kama Loka. And what's particularly specific to this world, of which we are a part, is that this creates in us sense desires, because these, for the Buddha, desires particularly strong ones come through the senses. And those are the ones that really tend to bind us to samsara, to rebirth, to a wish to become reborn in the future. And what we'll generally see with these realms, all of them, all of the three different worlds, the three different realms, what we'll see is a very close, tight relationship between states of the mind and the world. For the Buddha, these were really, really close. They were almost collapsed into one another, not quite. So the Buddha had a very close relationship between the world around us and the way we found out about that world, or the way our minds were. And this kind of close relationship, I think, found one of its most important kinds of results in the Buddha's understanding of rebirth and the karmic way that we are reborn. So the way that we're reborn into the next life is dependent upon the character of our mind within this life. So, for example, if we are in minds of hatred, throughout our entire life, if our mind is a mind that tends to be perfumed by hatred, then the next life will be a bad one. And similarly, if we have a mind of kindness, then our next life will be a good one. There's a very famous, I shouldn't say famous, but a sutta in the early texts where the Buddha talks to a couple of ascetics who are engaged in what's called the dog duty and the ox duty. That's one of the ways of translating what they do. And these were ascetics back in ancient India, we suppose they were there, who basically did a kind of penance by playing the role of dogs and oxen. So they would only eat like dogs or oxen, they would only behave like dogs or oxen, they would refrain from speaking, they would only, let's say, bark or grunt. And the hope was, these people hoped, that by doing that they could get a better rebirth, that they could somehow, the penance that they were doing by behaving in these ways would get them some kind of benefit in the next lifetime. And so these people went up to talk to the Buddha and asked them whether, they basically asking them whether they were doing the right thing. What do you think? Is this okay for us to be doing? And the Buddha, in no uncertain terms, said no, said you're not doing the right thing. Said basically that somebody who's doing the dog duty, who's behaving like a dog, will be reborn as a dog in the next life, which is not a particularly good life. And somebody behaving like an ox will be reborn as an ox in the next life. Again, not a particularly good rebirth from their point of view. So that is a very a pertinent and very easily understandable example of the general theme, which is that your next life depends upon this one. And so that is where all of these kinds of worlds come into play, in particular with kama loka, with this world of sense desires. Because we're going to see now that there is actually a whole lot of worlds within the world of sense desire, a whole lot of different universes within this first world. The first bunch are what's called the worlds of, or planes of deprivation. The planes of deprivation are the parts of the world of sense desire that are worse than human. And those begin with the hell realms, which of course are worlds of complete pain and torture. And this is what the Buddha would have said is where people who have minds of hatred go to after they die. Under them, or I should say over them, over the hell realms is the animal realm, and this is where the Buddha would have said that beings of great ignorance would have gone to when they die. So the animal realm is considered just above the hells, but really not a good realm to be reborn in. It's not a particularly pleasant place to live. Above that are the realm of the hungry ghosts, pretas as they're called. And we don't really have a notion of these in the Western tradition, but in the Buddhist tradition, these can be understood as beings with enormous bellies and very small mouths. So they're always hungry, they're always wanting to eat, but they can never get enough to fill themselves. And this is where people go if they have minds of greed during their lives. It's a kind of a reification of greed in a particular realm. Then on top of that there's some disagreement about whether it's the Titans. The Titans may be in this top realm, or they may have been moved around from somewhere else, depending on the time period. In any event, the Titans are very powerful beings that spend their entire lives in conflict with one another. So it's a life of striving and conflict. It's not a pleasant life. And again, we might say that beings of conflict and competition sort of, perhaps are capitalist heroes of the day are going to end up in this realm of the Titans because they spend their lives in competition and conflict with one another. And above them, these are all the planes of deprivation, that is to say the planes that are more painful, more pain-filled than the human realm. Above that we have the human realm. And I'll just say that above the humans we have the various lower heavens, heavenly realms. So that what's specific about the human realm is that it's balanced in the Buddhist view between pleasure and pain. That we tend to have a balance there. And this balance makes the human realm the best to be reborn into if we want to escape the cycle of rebirth. Because it's one where we see both sides. We see the good and the bad. And so being aware of the good and the bad, we are, I would say, highly attuned to the problems inherent in the good in particular, because we see that it's only temporary. But we're not so swamped by the bad, by pain and competition and all the rest, that we don't have time to deal with these things. So as a result, we have the time to deal with them, and we have the awareness. And so in that sense, Buddhism is really a kind of a humanism, because it views the human realm as the most salient and important. And it's the one that it's best to be reborn into if you want to escape the whole cycle. Now, above the human realm are the realms of the lower gods. And these are, in the Buddhist view, the realms that we would be reborn into if we do good deeds on earth. So for the Buddhist point of view, let's say Christians and other theists who follow their idea of God and who do good deeds while they're alive in order to be reborn into heaven will be reborn into one of these heavens. Now, these are, of course, all of the worlds I'm going to be talking about today, all worlds of every kind for Buddhism are temporary. No one in Buddhism, nothing is everlasting. Nothing is immortal. Everything is mortal. So if we enter one of these heavens, we'll be there for a long while. It'll be very pleasant, but eventually we will die and decline probably into one of the other realms. And all of the heavens, and in fact all of the Kama Loka, the world of sense desire, is under the sway of one god, which is Mara. Mara is the tempter. And I did an earlier video on Mara. I'll put a link to it up on the screen if you're not familiar with Mara. He is a sort of a central figure within early Buddhism, within all of Buddhism really. And he is the tempter. And whereas in the Western tradition we think of the tempter as the devil, as somebody who tempts us to do bad things and so be reborn in hell, Mara isn't like that. Mara doesn't want us to do evil, necessarily. He doesn't mind if we do. What he wants us to do is something. He wants us to do good or evil. He wants us to make some karmic action so we'll get reborn somehow. He is basically a personification of desire, because all of these lower realms, all of these realms I've talked about, are the realms of sense desire. And Mara is the god of sense desire, if you like, the god of desire. And so he's trying to sort of get you entwined in this rebirth in these world systems. And as a result, everybody, all of us, all of the lower realms, all of the lower realms of the gods, all of them are under his sway, with the exception of the people who are very far along the path. And the people who are very far along the Buddhist path, it is said, are people who are no longer in the view of Mara. They're out of the sway of Mara because they've overcome sense desire. And once you're able to overcome sense desire, then of course Mara has no control over you anymore. And so you're escaping his world, or his, the Kama Loka. The second of these three worlds in Buddhism is the Rupa Loka, or the world of form. Now, it's a strange title because the one we just talked about, the Kama Loka, also is a world where there's forms. Form just means physical things. And you might say, why call that the world of form? They're both world of form. This is one of the things that confused me with it when I was first learning about it. But basically what that word comes from is from the form jhanas. And because the second world system, the Rupa Loka, the world of forms, is actually the world of form jhana, if you like. Now, the jhanas are a suite of practices from early Buddhism, a suite of meditative practices that get us into deep states of meditation, that basically get us into absorptive states of meditation. They absorbed into their object. And when that happens, there are certain mind states that arise. There are pleasant mind states. So we can be suffused with a feeling of joy, of pleasure, of happiness. Or we can be suffused simply with a feeling of happiness. And in the fourth jhana, we're suffused with a feeling of equanimity. So there's 4 of them. And they're sort of levels. So the lower one is sort of a coarser and less pleasant, but still very pleasant. And it gets more refined as we go up. And I did a talk about this when I talked about right concentration, because this is, and I'll put that up here, right concentration is, in early Buddhism, which is the 8th of the Eightfold Path, is basically a practice of getting to these jhanas. So the idea is that if you are proficient in these jhanas, you will be reborn into the corresponding heaven in this second realm. So if you're proficient in the first jhana in particular, let's say, then you'll be reborn into Brahma's world. That is the world of the god Brahma. And Brahma is a very powerful god within early Buddhism, but he is in the lowest of these realms of jhanic attainment. Now we'll also may be aware of what's called the Brahma Viharas. The Brahma Viharas are the practices of cultivating certain kinds of very pleasant and skillful emotional states. That is, states of metta or loving kindness, states of compassion, of sympathetic joy, and of equanimity. And within that context, we're usually, within early Buddhism and later Buddhism as well for a long period, when we attain these, we attain them with jhana. That is to say, they're supposed to sort of get us into deep states of meditative absorption. And so, by analogy, if we are proficient in the jhanas, in the Brahma Viharas, that is because they're called Brahma Viharas. They're which means the abodes of Brahma, the houses of Brahma, because then we'll be reborn in the next life in the Brahma worlds, which are the abodes of Brahma. That's where Brahma lives. If we're very, very proficient in those, we'll be reborn in these Brahma worlds. If we're proficient in the second jhana, then we'll be reborn into worlds that are higher than those. And the third jhana even higher, and the fourth jhana even higher. So there's this retinue, a sort of a stack of different kinds of heavens, one above the other. And then above these 4 heavens, it's said, is a 5th heaven, which is the so-called pure abodes, which are the places into which non-returners get born. Now, non-returners, this is a big subject, one I can't really get into here, but basically in early Buddhism there was this notion, which is still retained within traditional Theravada belief, that your progress along the path goes in a certain way, and you can get to a certain stage just before attaining awakening, where you haven't yet attained awakening, but you're almost there. And let's say you haven't yet attained awakening, but you're just one tiny little step from there, and you die. Well, it's, too horrible to think you're going to go back to human life and have to redo the whole thing again. So there was this notion that, in fact, people who got to certain kinds of stage were what's called, they become non-returners. They never return to Kamaloka. They never return to the human realm, or in fact to any lower realm. They're simply reborn into what's called these pure abodes, pure, if you like, heavens of a complete purity of a certain kind, and then from there they attain awakening and escape the whole cycle. So, but those pure abodes are at the top of the jhana realm. They're sort of even higher than the 4th jhana, if you like. But we're still in the second one of these 3 groups of heavens, if you like, these 3 realms. Now, so where does that leave the 3rd realm? This is kind of odd, because it seems like we've sort of extinguished pretty much everything in early Buddhism. And the 3rd realm is the realm that's called the Arupa Loka, or the Formless realm. Actually, the formless realms, there are several of them. And these, just like the prior ones, tended to correspond to the 4 jhanas, which are these practices of early meditative attainment. The arupaloka, or the formless realms, pertain to the 4 achievements in formless meditation. Now, what is formless meditation? I did talk about it in an earlier video. I'll put it up on the screen here. I don't make a huge deal about it because it's really not important in early Buddhism, the formless realms. The formless realms are 4, just like with the jhanas, 4 different meditative attainments that we can come to where we're no longer associated with any kind of form. Now, I should say, with the jhanas, they're known as form jhanas because when we attain these kinds of meditative attainments of pleasure and that I just discussed, we feel them in the body. We feel the pleasure suffusing the body. So the body, an awareness of the body never goes away. The attainments suffuse our sort of internal idea of the body, our mental picture of the body. So as a result, form never goes away with the first 4. They're known as the form jhanas. The second group, these formless attainments, they're not called jhanas actually in the early tradition, they're called formless attainments, are attainments of the mind in which an awareness of the body is not present. So that's why they're called formless. The first of them is an awareness of infinite space. So we meditate upon infinite space. We get ourselves to a place where the mind is simply aware of infinite space. The second of these is an awareness of infinite consciousness. So the awareness of space goes away, and an awareness of consciousness, this consciousness pervading space, comes to the fore. Again, these are supposed to be sort of getting more and more refined. The third is the awareness of nothingness, so that we're aware of the fact that the consciousness is not blocked by anything, that there is a sense of nothingness in this consciousness, and it's not being stopped or blocked anywhere. And that's meditative attainment of nothingness, is one of the meditative attainments that the Buddha, or the Bodhisattva who's to become the Buddha, attained before attaining awakening from his teacher Alara Kalama. That's the third. And then the fourth is the awareness of what's called neither perception nor non-perception, which is where this awareness of nothingness is made so subtle that we're not even sure we're perceiving at all. So this awareness of perception itself is sort of liminal. It's in between. And that is the meditative attainment that the Buddha is said to have achieved from Uddaka Ramaputta, which was his last meditation teacher before he left off that whole way of approaching things and went into the forest by himself and attained awakening on his own. So, as you might expect, with these 4 formless attainments, if we're particularly proficient in them, we will be reborn in the next life into the corresponding heavens that deal with that formless attainment, and then we'll just be in that formless attainment for long periods of time. That's basically the picture that we get in with this third kind of realm. Now, this is quite a complicated cosmology, and many contemporary scholars have asked to what degree this cosmology goes back to the historical Buddha, and to what extent it was sort of laid on top by later interpreters, later thinkers, who may have been, let's say, more literal-minded than the Buddha, perhaps. And this is an active question of scholarship, and to that extent, I don't really have, a firm opinion about it. I think the scholarship is still going on. In particular, Richard Gombrich has said that he thinks originally that the attainments of the Brahmaviharas were towards awakening, that we could attain awakening through them, and that only later were they sort of understood as heavens. What I will say is that while this could be true, I certainly believe it could be true that these came later, it certainly wouldn't surprise me if they went back to the historical Buddha. Because, as I say, the Buddha did have a very, very close, he had in his mind a close relationship between states of the mind and states into which we would be reborn. So, as we already discussed with the states, with the with the case of the dog duty and the ox duty ascetic, and many others as well. There are many of these kinds of examples in the early texts. The Buddha really did believe that you would be reborn into the kind of world that your mind was used to in this life. And so, to that degree, it's completely consistent with the Buddha's own beliefs to hold that there were all these worlds, which to us nowadays seem strange and unusual and weird outside of our ordinary conception. But of course, the Buddha was, being a meditative adept, somebody who was extremely adept in meditation at the time, he would have been intimately familiar with these various states of mind. And again, to him, there were more than just states of mind. There were states that could get you reborn into certain kinds of future lives after this lifetime was expired. Now, but none of that means we can't use them as metaphors. There's a very famous and beautiful, wonderful early Zen story about a monk who is seated in meditation, and a samurai comes in and basically demands to be told about how to get into heaven. What are the gates to heaven and what are the gates to hell? How do I get to heaven and how do I avoid getting into hell? And the monk refuses to answer him. The samurai gets angry and the monk sort of taunts him, basically. And eventually the samurai gets sufficiently angry that he pulls his sword out and he's about to cut the monk's head off. And at this point the monk says, "So open the gates of hell." And then the samurai is so shocked by this, understands what he's just been told, and in kind of his shock, he puts away his sword. And then the monk says, "So open the gates of heaven." And of course, the story here is a story where we're taking these different realms, worlds, universes as metaphors that we can use in our own lives. So the gates of heaven aren't literally some other world. They are evil and hatred and anger in this very world. And the gates of heaven aren't some other world that we can attain to in a future life, but they are kindness and compassion and pacifism in this life, in this world. And so too, let's say the world of the Titans is a world that we see around us nowadays, played out in competition that we see in capitalism and so many aspects of the modern world. And of course, the higher realms of form and formlessness we see played out nowadays among a very small subset of people who are able to attain these meditative attainments. But it's important, most important for the Buddha, which is true to us nowadays as well, to see the dangers in all of them, to see the dangers in all of these worlds, whether they be hells, whether they be heavens, whether they be realms that are higher even than the highest heavens. They all have their dangers. Their dangers are that they're not permanent, that they all will have their end. No matter how beautiful they are, no matter how pleasant they are, they'll all come to an end at some point, and we'll all have to deal with worse things, normal things afterwards. And this is where, again, the human realm is really the central realm for Buddhism. Buddhism is a kind of humanism. And so, being in that human realm, we are brought face to face with this truth of impermanence all the time. And we should be brought face to face with the fact that no matter how many realms there are, no matter how many worlds there may be, they all share that characteristic of being eventually unsatisfactory. And so the wise lesson to take from this apparently weird and strange and unusual kind of worldview, of cosmology, is to say it doesn't really matter at the end of the day what the cosmology is. The practice is the same. The practice is a practice of letting go, of understanding the unsatisfactory nature of it all, of understanding the changeable nature of it all, and of understanding the selfless nature of it all, that we don't find ourselves anywhere in any of this. And so we can let it go. We don't have to be personal about it. We don't have to hold it personally. And I think if we come to this from that direction, we're coming to it from the right direction. No matter what the actual facts may be about what really exists, no matter what the actual facts may be about whether the Buddha taught this or didn't teach it, it doesn't matter at the end of the day. So if you got something out of this, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing. If you're interested in supporting the work that we're doing here, check out my Patreon channel, or Patreon page. It's linked to down below. You may be interested in some of the material there. Thanks so much for all of you, for subscribers and patrons on Patreon, and I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. And meanwhile, be well.